Be warned, there are some minor spoilers ahead. But anyway, we time skip to see a young boy with red hair, currently just lying in a field. Now, the most distinctive feature of this boy was the mark on his forehead and his currently bleeding eyes. Another, person seemed to be there. He seemed to be crouched over the boy and crying, but unfortunately, he didn't really care. He continued to just blatantly stare up at the blue sky. This boy's name was Tanjiro Kamado, the eldest son of the Kamado household. And unfortunately, he had to leave his little sister Nezuko behind to go and see their parents. In in unfortunate and in unfortunate turn of events with the Battle of Muzan, Tanjiro unfortunately had to be put down in a few words. Luckily, during the exchangement, he was able to finally kill Muzan and rid Nezuko of her curse. And in doing so, Tanjiro wasn't in close range to Muzan and unfortunately had been infected with a bit of his blood. Not a bit. Muzan had ended up stabbing Tanjiro in his side and began to pump the boy full of his blood, planning on leaving behind a successor to take the throne and finally take the sun. But before, anything major can happen, Tanjiro was unfortunately cut down by the few remaining Hashira that were there. This unfortunately having to be Gyo, Gyu, his, sensei. The Hashira that really recommended him to become a demon slayer. He had seen the tears welling up inside the man's eyes, but couldn't exactly do anything as he couldn't move his body. He attempted to console his sister, but unfortunately couldn't do anything. His arms were limp by his side, and his eyes seemed to slowly, just go numb. Tanjiro seemed to just ponder his death. Tanjiro looked off to the side and just saw not Nezuko, Zenitsu and Inosuke were currently just passed out. He tried to shake his head, but did not accomplish it. Tanjiro just merely, his eyes just merely went back to the sky as they finally, slowly but surely closed. Tanjiro was briefly awakened as he saw a bright light encompass himself. Tanjiro's eyes quickly opened up, and he quickly felt a soft few cries going on beside him. Tanjiro looked off to the side to see a few people currently staring at him. Well, not him. Another person was currently beside him that was crying louder than even himself. And that's when Tanjiro finally took notice of this. He was crying. He was crying. Not crying, he was wailing. Tanjiro just looked out to the side and saw a baby with black hair and red eyes. Tanjiro seemed to stare at the baby before finally he closed his eyes and pretended that it was all some sick dream. Tanjiro shook his head as he just began to think what the hell this was. Tanjiro continued to silently hear the other cries of the person beside him. Tanjiro just continued to try and zone out, but unfortunately he couldn't do it. And that's when we are hit by a time skip to when Tanjiro is finally, well, let's say around about 8. Now Tanjiro is, he's just different from all his other siblings, as well most reincarnated people are, but anyway. Tanjiro would often, just be by himself or be, he would either be alone or he would either be missing. Not as in, missing, gone, ran away missing, but just missing in action, MIA. So he would go missing, but then he would just come back. And so Tanjiro, most of his siblings would either flock to his parents in need of their praise or help, but Tanjiro would often find, solutions to his problems on his own. And that's what differentiated him from all his other siblings. And also with the fact that Tanjiro wasn't born with the same iconic black hair as his other siblings. His hair seemed to, just barely reach, just barely reach dark red. If you would have seen from afar, you would probably think his hair was black, but if you just saw him up close, you would actually see that his hair was a dark shade of red. Tanjiro's eyes was also another thing that differentiated him from his siblings. Tanjiro unfortunately had been, given birth to with an unfortunate mark on his forehead. And this also was the fact that, you could immediately tell the difference between him and his siblings. The fact that Tanjiro had a whole, think of Tanjiro's Slayer mark. That's all you should think about. Tanjiro just basically had a Slayer mark on his forehead. So that's what that, mark would immediately tell you the difference between all of his, siblings and Tanjiro. And also with the fact that most people could just, sense normal reserves from Tanjiro. Now, the thing about Tanjiro's family is that, they are well known around, the world for their massive magical reserves. Meaning that, Tanjiro's family would mostly be, how can I say this? Sorcerers and not exactly up close fighters. They would mostly keep their range and just fight from the back while supporting everyone else. But due to the fact that Tanjiro unfortunately had average magic reserves, they couldn't exactly teach Tanjiro the magic that they knew. Since, that would absolutely drain him from his magic and he would, just end up being completely numb for a few days. And so due to this, Tanjiro unfortunately had to be given physical training. And he was often isolated from all his other siblings. And so 9 times out of 10 you would find Tanjiro either alone practicing swordsmanship or you would find him reading a book. Tanjiro seemed to, just merely be drawn by his sister. Him and his sister seemed to be, almost identical, except for their hair and the mark on their foreheads, obviously. Tanjiro's sister had dark red eyes similar to their father's and had dark raven hair just like their mother. Now, I haven't exactly come up names for the family, but Tanjiro, we will just skip to find Tanjiro just practicing swordsmanship. Now, Tanjiro is extremely, how can I say this, different, I guess. Due to all the grief Tanjiro had previously seen in his life, he would often, just either be by himself or would just either be, by himself, I guess. Tanjiro would, most of the time be practicing swordsmanship. It was a common hobby for him. In a world like this, Tanjiro had taken note of a few things. Instead of the normal Slayer arts that people were used to, hold on, give me a few minutes. Sorry about that, but instead of the normal Slayer arts that most people were used to, these people would use many different type of things. These people would either A, use magic, B, use arts, I see just fight up close, well, close quarters. Now, in this case, arts are a bit of a special thing. Arts are people, well, born with special talents, meaning that most people can, well, from the get-go, cast, well, magic without having to do the, well, how can I say this? The iconic rituals, I guess. They don't have to say the symbols for them to actually cast magic. They just will just think of the magic, think of the spell that they want to use, and it would automatically be casted for them. Talents like those are what most people often look for, and in Tanjiro, one of those talents lay dormant. Tanjiro took in a deep breath as he readied his sword in a familiar stance. He mumbled a few words under his breath before he quickly seemed to just disappear from where he stood and seemed to just suddenly appear on the opposite end of the training ground. This was the Hinokami Kagura, or in other words, sun breathing. Tanjiro, on the other hand, couldn't exactly do the breathing forms. He could only enhance his body for a few seconds before he had to, well, unfortunately take a break. Why? Because his lungs weren't as developed, meaning every time Tanjiro took a breath, he was putting a lot of strain on his lungs, and, well, of course, his body, since Tanjiro's body isn't fully, well prepared for the breathing styles. Tanjiro was, well, very, very skilled in this case. Tanjiro, of course, knew that the mark on top of his forehead was, of course, the Slayer mark. That only meant that he had, unfortunately, 25 years left to live. Tanjiro once again raised his sword as he continued to go back to practicing his swordsmanship. That was his only friend in such a world like this. After all, he was alone most of the time. Tanjiro was suddenly interrupted as he heard his sister cry out his name on the other end of, well, the arena that he was currently standing in. Tanjiro's sister quickly ran up to him before giving him a hug. Tanjiro swiftly put his hand on her head and asked her what she wanted. She quickly took a few steps back before telling him to look at what she can do. She quickly seemed to materialize what was a ball of water before sending it off in a random direction, almost like a crossbow. Tanjiro stared down at his sister for a few minutes before he, well, swiftly smiled at her. Seems like she had the talent to cast magic without, well, needing the necessary things or the necessary sayings. Tanjiro merely shook his head before saying that, well, if she wanted to be stronger, she would have to, well, perfect her talent in hopes of catching up to him one day. Now, Tanjiro was exactly known around his household for being excruciatingly painful to deal with. Why I say that? Every time someone was tasked with training Tanjiro, he would often, well, just merely, how can I say this, dismiss them with a few strikes, I guess. Meaning that every time a swordsman was told to train their child, Tanjiro would unfortunately put the man down in a quick means with a wooden bow staff. Tanjiro was well known around the household for being excellent in swordsmanship, something that he had to make up for with his magic reserves. Tanjiro took in a breath as he turned around and quickly sheathed his sword. He mumbled once again a few words before a whistle seemed to just cut through the air. A bluish aura seemed to cover Tanjiro, and he once again seemed to, the rocks under Tanjiro, or the ground under Tanjiro's feet seemed to visibly, crack under the pressure that was currently being exuded from him. This was Tanjiro's own technique, it being called mana release stage 1. Tanjiro would most often release all of his mana and would distribute it throughout his body and just quickly strengthen it, almost like a coat of armor. Tanjiro would then once again just step off, and this would most times result in the ground beneath Tanjiro's feet breaking apart at the sudden power that was once again put on them. Tanjiro demonstrated this stance to his sister before once again he seemed to take in a breath and seemed to step off the ground. A few rocks were sent flying as he seemed to just currently wish at what appeared to be a training dummy. He quickly sliced through it before it exploded in a burst of straw and wool. Tanjiro released a breath as he quickly sheathed his sword and turned around to look at his sister. Tanjiro had to hold back a cough as he saw his sister smiling at him, a smile that Tanjiro knew all too well. Tanjiro seemed to get a swift flashback back to his younger sister, Nezuko. Wow, yeah, this is where I'm gonna end it.